When I inherited my grandfather's sprawling 120-acre property on the outskirts of town, I thought it would remain what it always had been, a quiet escape from the chaos of city life, full of open fields, dense groves of oak trees, and a creek that sparkled under the summer sun. But apparently, not everyone shared my vision for its future because while I was working overseas for 2 years, a certain group of self entitled developers, led by none other than the infamous HOA, Karen, decided that my absence meant free real estate, and without ever contacting me or checking the actual land deeds, they built an entire neighborhood, 68 houses complete with manicured lawns, a community pool, and a tacky HOA sign boasting Oak Ridge Estates, luxury living with pride. And when I returned home and saw asphalt roads where wildflowers used to bloom, rows of nearly identical beige houses where deer once grazed, and a group of smug homeowners sipping wine on porches as if they owned the place, I felt like I had stepped into an alternate universe. But the cruelest twist was Karen herself, the self-proclaimed HOA president, who had the gall to march right up to my truck as I parked by the old gatepost that still had my grandfather's initials carved into it, waving a clipboard in my face as she told me in no uncertain terms that outsiders weren't allowed in their private community and that trespassing would be reported to security, and I'll admit, for a moment, I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. After all, how could someone be so blind as to tell the rightful landowner he didn't belong on his own property? But as she prattled on about bylaws and fines, I realized that this wasn't just arrogance, it was theft on the grandest scale, and the smug way she referred to our development made it clear she believed she was untouchable. So instead of arguing, I simply nodded, drove off as if cowed, and spent the next week combing through my grandfather's meticulously kept records, dusty maps, and the official deeds that bore my name in bold ink, confirming beyond any shadow of doubt that not only was I the rightful owner of every inch of that land, but that no one had ever received permission, permits, or rights to build upon it. And when I brought this to a real estate attorney, his eyes nearly bulged out of his head as he said, "Son, you realize what this means? You own every foundation those houses are built on. Legally speaking, the homeowners don't own the dirt under their homes. You do." And in that moment, a seed of poetic justice began to sprout in my mind, because while HOA Karen and her cronies thought they had cornered me, the truth was they had accidentally built their dream homes on quicksand, and I held the legal key to either bury them or sell them out from under their noses. So I decided to play it slow, careful, and above all, legal. Because if Karen thought she was going to bully me off my own land, she was about to learn that I didn't fight with angry words or HOA bylaws. I fought with the law itself, and the law was entirely on my side. The next phase of my plan required patience and precision, because while my gut screamed to storm back into Oak Ridge Estates and rub the truth in Karen's smug face, my lawyer advised me to let the homeowners dig their own graves by continuing to act as though nothing was wrong. So I spent weeks gathering evidence, pulling county records, and documenting every single violation that had occurred during the development process, from the illegal paving of roads across protected wetlands to the absence of a single signed easement or construction permit. And the deeper I dug, the more shocking it became, because not only had the developer cut corners, but it turned out Karen had been instrumental in fast-tracking the entire project by bribing a city inspector with HOA funds, which meant she had literally stolen from her own community to build their homes on land she didn't even own, and yet the residents still treated her like a queen, bowing to her petty rules about mailbox height, fence color, and lawn care, while unknowingly living in houses that legally belonged to me. So when my lawyer finally said, "It's time," we filed the quiet title action that would formally assert my ownership, and within weeks, the court recognized me as the undisputed landowner with full rights over every square foot of Oak Ridge Estates, which meant in blunt terms that every single homeowner was now a tenant squatting on my property. And while I could have immediately evicted them, my lawyer and I agreed on a more profitable and poetic approach. Instead of kicking them out, we would sell their houses right out from under them. Because although they had purchased their homes from a shady developer, the absence of land rights in those contracts made them little more than glorified leaseholders. And as the rightful owner of the land, I had the authority to bundle the homes as assets and place them on the market. And when word of this hit, Chaos erupted like a wildfire through the community, with panicked homeowners demanding emergency HOA meetings while Karen frantically assured them it was just a misunderstanding and that her legal team would handle it. But when she strutted into court and tried to challenge my claim, the judge barely let her finish before smacking down her arguments, pointing out that she had no standing, no deeds, and no authority whatsoever, which left her sputtering and red faced as the reality began to sink in. Not only was her entire empire built on stolen land, but she had just led 68 families into a disaster that could cost them their life savings. And while some tried to confront me directly, accusing me of heartlessness, I calmly reminded them that they had bought homes from a conwoman who never bothered to check the rightful ownership of the land, and that I wasn't stealing their property, but rather exercising the rights that had been mine from the start. So I gave them three options. They could pay me a fair market, lease to continue living in their homes, they could purchase the land underneath their houses from me at my price, or they could walk away entirely and let me resell the homes on the open market. And though many of them were furious, the truth was they had no leverage because the law was airtight, the judge had spoken, and I held all the cards. But the most satisfying part was watching Karen's reign collapse as neighbors who once worshipped her now turned against her, shouting at meetings, tearing down her flyers, and even spray painting "liar" across her pristine white garage door, because they finally realized the woman who preached about community pride had actually conned them into financial ruin. And as I drove past in my truck watching the chaos unfold, I couldn't help but think of my grandfather and how proud he would have been to see that his land wasn't stolen, but defended with the very laws he had always respected. And though part of me pitted the innocent families who had been duped, the other part felt no remorse, because ignorance doesn't excuse theft, and if they truly wanted to stay, they'd have to buy back what was mine brick by brick, dollar by dollar, under terms I alone would set. The fallout from the court ruling spread like a shockwave through Oak Ridge Estates, and it didn't take long for the polished veneer of suburban paradise to shatter into chaos, because once the homeowners realized that their property deeds were practically worthless without the land underneath, panic set in, and that panic quickly mutated into anger, suspicion, and betrayal, with neighbors shouting at one another during heated HOA meetings, some blaming Karen for her arrogance and negligence, others blaming the developer who had disappeared into thin air, and a smaller but louder group blaming me as if I were the villain, even though I had simply reclaimed what was mine. But while their community unraveled, I remained calm and methodical, working with my lawyer and a trusted real estate firm to begin parceling out the land in ways that maximize profit. And that's when the most ironic twist of all began to play out. The very same residents who had once sneered at me as an outsider now came crawling to my office, hat in hand, begging for deals on the plots beneath their homes. And while I was willing to negotiate with those who approached me respectfully, I made sure my prices reflected not only the market value, but also the years of trespass, damage to my land, and the sheer audacity of trying to push me off it, which meant some families swallowed their pride and paid hefty sums to secure peace of mind, while others refused and ended up watching as their houses were legally listed for sale to outside buyers, and you'd better believe investors jumped at the chance to buy up entire blocks of homes at discounted rates, knowing they could flip them for massive profits once the legal dust settled. But Karen, true to her toxic personality, refused to accept reality and instead doubled down on her delusion, holding late-night emergency meetings in her living room where she convinced a group of diehard loyalists that they could fight back by refusing to recognize my ownership, a tactic that only led to more lawsuits and financial ruin as they stopped paying me rent or attempting to purchase their lots, forcing me to file for eviction. And nothing gave me greater satisfaction than watching the sheriff's department escort families out of their own homes while Karen stood on the sidewalk screaming about unconstitutional theft and community rights, as if shouting the words would magically erase the fact that she had built an empire of lies. But her grip on power slipped further when angry residents discovered that she had siphoned off HOA funds for years to cover her shady deals. And once the bank statements became public, showing thousands spent on lavish vacations and consulting fees, the same people who once applauded her every word now turned on her with venom. Some even filing criminal charges, while others simply abandoned Oak Ridge altogether, leaving half-finished houses and empty streets that resembled a ghost town more than a luxury community. And though I had expected resistance, what I hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which Oak Ridge collapsed under its own corruption, because within 6 months of reclaiming my rights, more than half the homes had either been sold off to investors or repossessed through eviction, while the rest were caught in limbo as their residents scrambled to raise money to buy the land beneath them. And through it all, Karen's desperate schemes grew more pathetic from attempting to rally media outlets to paint me as a greedy villain, to filing frivolous lawsuits that judges dismissed in minutes, to even staging a protest outside my lawyer's office with a handful of diehards waving poorly written signs. But every time she struck out, my position only grew stronger because the law was ironclad, my paperwork flawless, and the judges increasingly frustrated with her antics, until finally she lost what little credibility she had left, becoming a pariah even among her own neighbors, who now whispered about suing her personally to recoup their losses. And as I drove through Oak Ridge one evening, the once pristine lawns now brown and overgrown, the community pool drained and littered with trash, and the HOA clubhouse boarded up with foreclosure notices, I realized that I hadn't just reclaimed my land, I had dismantled an empire of arrogance brick by brick, exposing Karen for the fraud she was and reminding everyone that when you build your dreams on stolen ground, you're only ever a guest, and the landlord always comes knocking eventually. By the time the dust finally began to settle, Oak Ridge Estates looked less like the polished luxury community Karen had once bragged about, and more like a cautionary tale carved into the earth itself, because the sprawling subdivision that had sprung up overnight on my grandfather's land was now fractured into a patchwork of outcomes. Half the homes sold off to investors who transformed them into rental properties, a few families scraping together every penny to legally purchase their lots from me and secure true ownership at last, and the rest standing vacant, stripped of their occupants and slowly decaying as weeds crept up driveways and for sale signs weathered in the sun. But the greatest collapse, of course, was Karen's, because the woman who once strutted around like a queen with her clipboard and whistle had fallen so far that even her most loyal followers abandoned her, leaving her broke, disgraced, and facing a mountain of lawsuits, not only from angry residents, but also from the state itself for fraud, mismanagement of HOA funds, and bribery of public officials. And I will never forget the day she was finally arrested, standing on her once pristine porch in handcuffs as a news crew filmed her tear-streaked face while she shrieked about conspiracies and vendettas. The same neighbors who used to fear her now standing at a distance, shaking their heads with disgust. And while part of me thought it was almost too cinematic to be real, the other part knew it was the exact ending she had written for herself through her greed and arrogance, because you can only trample people's rights for so long before the law comes crashing down on you like hammer, and in her case, that hammer was forged by her own hubris. But for me, the end of this ordeal wasn't about revenge, it was about legacy, because once I had sold off what I wanted and retained the sections of land closest to my grandfather's old homestead, I made sure to restore the natural beauty of the place by replanting trees where roads had been carved, reopening the creek that developers had partially dammed, and fencing off areas for wildlife to return. Because while the investors could do what they wanted with their half-empty cul-de-sacs, I intended to honor the spirit of the land the way my grandfather had taught me, and as I stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, watching the sun sink behind the horizon and light up the hills in golden fire, I thought about how close I had come to losing everything if I hadn't acted, how easily a man's inheritance could be stolen by a mob armed with arrogance and ignorance, and how satisfying it was to have turned the tables not with violence or vengeance, but with the quiet strength of paperwork, patience, and the law itself, which, when wielded correctly, proved far more devastating than any weapon, because it allowed me not just to reclaim what was mine, but to legally sell the very houses Karen had thought she ruled, leaving her with nothing but empty promises and a ruined reputation. And in the end, as Oak Ridge Estates faded into a half-forgotten chapter of local history, whispered about as the neighborhood built on stolen land, I felt a deep and abiding sense of closure, knowing that I had defended my family's legacy taught a lesson to every smug HOA tyrant who thought they could bully their way into ownership, and ensured that the next time someone thought they could build their empire on another man's foundation, they would remember the story of the landowner who sold their houses right out from under them, legally, fairly, and without a shred of mercy for those who thought the rules didn't apply to them.